became drinkable as a result of this miracle that Hashem performed at Marah. And upon experiencing this, we're told, Sham Samlo Choku Mishpat. There was there at Marah that Hashem gave the Jewish people statutes, Visham Nisahu, and there he tested them. And then the test's outcome is the following verse, which is going to be really the essential pasuk of this shiur. Vayomer, and Hashem said, Im Shema Tishma L'Kol Hashem Elokecha, if you listen to Hashem's voice, Vayasher Be'inav Ta'aseh, and you do that which is yashar, which is straight and upright in God's eyes, V'hazanta L'Mitzvosav, and you listen to His commandments, V'shamarta Kol Chukav, and you guard all God's statutes, then Kol HaMachala Asher Samti Mitzrayim Lo Asim Alecha, Kani Hashem Rofecha, then all of the ailments that I place upon Egypt, I will not place upon you, because I am Hashem who heals you. I am Hashem who am your doctor, as it were. Now, this pasuk becomes the basis for an explanation which is said over in the name of the Vilna Gaon for a portion of our Seder, where at the very end, or very close to the very end of Magid, we have a section of numerology about the calculation of the number of miracles that took place at Yam Suf. And we have there the opinion of Rabbi Yossi HaGalili, Rabbi Eliezer, and Rabbi Akiva. One who says that there were 50 miracles at Yam Suf, one who says that there was 200, and one who says that there was 250 miracles. And the Vilna Gaon explains that the reason for this exercise in numbers is in order to make use of this pasuk that we just saw, that increasing the number of miracles and wonders that take place in Mitzrayim, that thereby becomes a basis for greater protection based upon this pasuk, that these things will not then happen to us later on within our history. Now, there are a number of problems with this Vilna Gaon's explanation. One of them relates to the fact that the pasuk refers to machalot and not makot, and there's a seeming in addition at Mitzrayim, at Yam Suf, there's no indication that somehow Mitzrayim got sick. It was that they were killed by the waters there. It was not a function of anything else. And what's more, the Ibn Ezra, in explaining the psukim at Marah, argues that in fact the Jewish people were promised more than just makot, but all the machalot of Mitzrayim, going beyond just what took place at Yam Suf, they'd also be protected against. And I think that this is an opening for an approach, which would be to understand that Marah is about more than just the makot, but that Marah is about a breaking from a certain Egyptian approach to medicine and to illness that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is putting forward to the Jewish people in this moment. And here I think it's worthwhile just to take a quick pause and to go beyond that which I spoke about during my two first components of the Shabbat Hagadol Drasha. And that is to ask, what is it, or what was it to be in Egypt? What was the medical culture? What was the life culture within Egypt? Now, G.K. Chesterton, the great British author and writer, said about the United States that it was a nation with the soul of a church. And if I might be so bold, I would say that Egypt was a nation with the soul of a hypochondriac. That Egypt was the place in which people were obsessed with illness and with the cures and the methods by which to avoid such illness. And the earliest sources of medical texts that we have in the archaeological record come out of Egypt. That this was the place where the first medical researchers were found. And this is where they wrote down their findings. And a lot of this has to do with the Egyptian practices of embalming, where they would study the body at that point and their mummies that they would create from their embalming techniques. But it was more than that too. And it's worthwhile for us to ask why. Why is it that Egypt was the center of medicine in ancient times? And some of this has to do with the prevalence of diseases within Egypt, that Egypt was a place of a large population and often a certain amount of overcrowding that would take place within it. And in addition, Egypt was a place where, because there was a certain centralized society where people were able to be together and were able to have certain efficiencies that come about when you have large populations together, you have a specialization which is possible that's not possible when you are more diffuse and people are living off in the wilderness. You have to do everything yourself. When you're in a big city, well, then you can have butchers and bakers and candlestick makers, and you can also have doctors too. And in Egypt, that was a place where you would have that type of specialization, where you could have people who would be physicians, certainly to those of the upper classes, but even below that as well. This was a common profession in Egypt in ways that was not true in other places. Now, when the Jewish people leave this culture, when they leave this place, what happens? What sorts of worries do they entertain? What sorts of experiences do they begin to think about? And in this regard, it's worthwhile for us to consider that the Jewish people may not just have been worried about where their water was going to come from, but they're also going to be concerned about where their medical care was going to come from when they left Egypt, when they had grown within that society and they had been formed by it. When they leave, they have this great question, which is, what do we do now? What do we do when there's a problem? Where do we go? What happens when we don't have the resources that we had when we were in this great metropolis of the capital of Egypt, or for that matter, the entire society of Egypt along the Nile? Where do we go for our specialized needs in this new place, in this new reality? Now, it's interesting to consider that the role of Egypt as being the center of medicine. But as we, just as a quick aside, Egypt was also the center of something else as well. And that was, Egypt was the center of bread production, that Egypt was the great place of wheat. It was the bread baskets of the ancient world. And along the banks of the Nile, that's where they would produce massive amounts of grain. And there was a great heritage around the creation and the production of a fine bread that was part of Egyptian culture. And that in our breaking from Egypt, it's not stam that we choose matzah as our symbol of our freedom. It's also a break from this culture surrounding the production of bread that was such a piece of Egyptian life. And I believe that that's something which is also true when it comes to medicine as well. So in this regard, I'd like to just recall for us the explanation of the Ibn Ezra that I quoted in the second part of the Shir earlier. So if you're following along in the source sheet, you can see the Ibn Ezra in source number 8. And the Ibn Ezra here draws a parallel between the experience at Mara with another experience that the Jewish people had. And this is what he says, source number 8. Yesh lecha lizkor, is you should remember, ki be'inecha ra'ita hamachala ba'negaim v'amakot asher samti ba'amam b'mitzrayim, that with your eyes you saw not just the makot, but also the machala and the negaim, the plagues and the ailments that I placed upon the Egyptians, Bavur Shemar Dubi, because they rebelled against me. V'matati shmor chukai timalet mehem, and if you abide by and you keep my commandments, then you will escape all of these things. Shelo aseh lecha kasher asiti lahem, for I will not do to you as I did to them. So in escaping Egypt, we avoid Egyptian culture, but we're also meant to learn and take something with us from that experience. And so in looking at the Egyptian experience, we're to associate with Egypt, not just makot, but machalot and negaim. And that part of Egyptian culture involves these sicknesses which are connected to Egyptian society. And we're to remember them as we leave Egypt, now associating with them a certain moral calculus to explain why it is that the Egyptians received these things. Va'od, ki ani Hashem hayat rof'echa mikol machala shegazarti liota al haaretz. But not just that, but that I am Hashem will be your doctor for all of the machalot, all the sicknesses that I have declared shall be upon the earth. Now, this is the earth more broadly, not just Egypt, but for all of the earth. Wherever you are, there will be sicknesses that you will experience, and God will be your rofei. Ein lecha tzorich l'rofei kasher rafati hamayim hamarim she'en yecholet b'rofim l'raf'am. You will not need Egyptian doctors anymore, because I, God, will be your rofei, just as I was able to heal the waters. Now, were the waters sick? No, the waters were unpalatable. And this is something that a doctor, an Egyptian doctor, cannot do, but God can. In this regard, it is a flip of a coin compared to what the Makot were. Vinei davar mara hafach hamaka harishona. And behold, that the matter that took place in Marat was the exact opposite of the first plague that takes place of the 10 plagues. Of course, being the plague of Dam. That with Dam, because originally the waters of the Nile, of the Yaor, were sweet, they were drinkable. But now, because of the plague, they were no longer able to drink from them. Vikan, and here at Marah, Hamayim Amarim Shabu Metukim. Now the waters become, through a miracle, they become sweet. And behold, God is able to do the thing and also its opposite. Now keep this in mind. This is an important term to keep in mind as we're seeing what is, I will argue, a new ideology or a new philosophy of thinking through nature and thinking through life and thinking through medicine. And this is that God is able to do the thing and also its opposite. That there's something almost counterintuitive that is something which is going on here with this new lesson. And therefore, it is necessary for you to be careful about your relationship with God, that you are not to rebel against God, but rather you are to love God because God will do good for you.
Mark? Hi.
Yes, Sarah.
Oh, no, sorry.
That's okay, no worries.
Okay.
So in the second part of the drasha, I went into great depths to explain some of the problematic nature of this what could be derived from this Ibn Ezra and from some of the other sources in our tradition as it relates to a unwillingness to go to doctors when you need to. And I made very clear that from the Talmud and from elsewhere, this is not our approach to life, but rather we are not somech al hanes, that we do not rely upon divine intervention in such a way, but rather we do go to doctors, that the Talmud derives from the Psukim v'rapo yirapeh, that we are required, Bikan nitan reshutz l'rofei l'rapot, that you are required to go to a doctor, that this is a mitzvah to do so. But nevertheless, there still is a residue here of an argument that says that God is more than just a force of nature that is distant, but rather is also close to us, able to bring us refu'ah as well. And so in this next part of the shiur, I want to delve into that point, that we go to doctors, but yet this message of Marah, the message of this pasuk, is something that we keep with us, and how it is that we think about life, how it is that we think about health, how it is that we think about medicine. So here I'd like to turn to a source that relates to the Egyptian understanding of how health worked. Before I do that, though, I want to take a question. Yes, Shana.
So my question is sort of a larger idea, which is this whole business of interfering with providence. I mean, if someone is poor, isn't that what God decided? Why do we give tzedakah? If someone is in trouble, isn't that God who put that person in that situation? Why do we intervene?
So that certainly is a philosophy that's out there, and it's something that I referenced in I think source number 6 in Contemporary Halachic Problems, where we saw the views of the Karaites and some Christian groups, where it says human intervention in causing or speeding the therapeutic process is then, in a sense, interference with a deliberate design of providence. And what Shana is offering is the counter argument, which is that, well, why then are we allowed to eat if we are not intended to be hungry? Why would God not make us hungry? So I guess this gets to that classic joke about the guy who was so religious, and he had so much faith in God, and all of a sudden there was a flood, and he said, you know what, I'm not going to rely on any human intervention to save me. I'm going to rely upon God to bring forward a miracle to save me. I've been so righteous my whole life. God will save me. So the neighbor comes and knocks on the door and says, sir, buddy, tzaddik, you got to get out of here. Come on. And the guy says, no. God's going to save me. I don't have to worry about floods. And then the neighbor says, I had enough of you. I'm going to get going. I got to save myself here. So then the police come in boats, and they come and they knock on the door, say, God, got to get out of here. Come on. You got to come get on the boat. And of course, the tzaddik says, no. I rely upon God. God's going to save me. And then he climbs all the way up to the roof of his house, and then a helicopter comes with a ladder off the helicopter and says, hello, come get on the ladder. And of course, the guy says, no, I trust in God. God's going to save me. Sure enough, the guy dies, goes up to heaven, and God says to this guy, Yankel, Shmerel, Beryl, what are you doing? The guy says, well, God, you didn't follow up. You said you were going to save me. I was so righteous my whole life. What happened? And so God looks at him and, I sent you your neighbor. I sent you a boat. I sent you a helicopter. It wasn't enough for you. So yes, so the point here is that our philosophy is not that of the Karaites. It's not that of these Christian theologians who counsel against seeking medical attention. We very much believe in seeking medical advice. But within our thinking about medical advice, there is something in it which is there's more to it than just the helicopter, the boats, and the neighbor knocking on the door. That those also have a divine, a godly element to them. And that's where I want to move to now. So let's start getting into a little bit about the philosophy of Egyptian medicine. So you can see in source number 14, I took off a summary. This is like an encyclopedia article about ancient Egyptian medicine. This is not high level scholarship here, folks. This is off the internet. So this is how it goes. The channel theory came from observing farmers who dug out irrigation channels for their crops. It allowed medicine to move from entirely spiritual cures towards practical, natural ones. Okay, and hear that, practical, natural ones. The doctors believe that, as in irrigation, channels provide the body with roots for good health. If blockages occurred, they used laxatives to unblock them. The heart was the center of 46 channels, seen as types of tubes. It is true that human veins, arteries, and intestines are types of tubes. However, the Egyptians did not understand that these channels had different functions. In other words, in Egyptian medical thinking, there was this idea that the human body, in some respects, paralleled the geography of Egypt itself. That Egypt had a flow of water that flowed through Egypt into channels that they would use to irrigate their fields and to grow their crops. And the philosophy was that just as this is true of the land of Egypt, is also true of the human body as well. And so by pouring into our body foods, drinks, water, wine, these things will go through us. And if they are allowed to irrigate appropriately, then we will be healthy. But if there are blockages along the way, if there are things that are not allowed to flow as they are supposed to, that is the basis for all problems with health. And so it is the role of the physician to remove blockages that would somehow interfere with the proper workings of the body. Blockages in the human channels were thought to result from the doings of Wekadu and evil spirits. When Wekadu came to the surface of the body, it showed as pus. The idea that bodily function played a role in health was a breakthrough in the history of medicine. So even as we think about medicine as being something, or Egyptian medicine as being a little bit, I guess, ancient or foolish to some degree, the point here is that this is really a forward step in many ways in thinking about how human beings would have thought about their health before this point. That there's a great deal of research that Egyptian doctors did around the heart, around all sorts of things, around the lungs, and so on and so forth. The ancient Egyptians believed that the body consisted of a system of channels, or metu. One researcher notes that they believed that bodily fluids could enter this system, including feces. This would have a negative effect, and enemas became an important method of treatment for many conditions, including malaria and smallpox. The Ebers Papyrus, this is one of the oldest medical documents in human history, notes that vessels run from the heart to all four limbs and every part of the body. When a doctor, Sekhmet priest, or exorcist places their hands on any part of the body, they are examining the heart because all vessels come from the heart. So if we were to take this approach and transpose it onto the Ibn Ezra's ideas of what Mara teaches us, there is a radical departure specifically in relationship to water that is being conveyed at Mara that breaks away from this Egyptian ideology about how health works, and that it's not simply a function of this consistency of the flow of materials through the body that makes for health, but rather there can be something counterintuitive that can also take place. That the Egyptians are all about the purity of the materials that come in. And if something comes in healthy, then it's going to be a basis for continued health. The Egyptians spent a lot of time focusing on diet and also on cleanliness for their understandings of the body and of health. And the Ibn Ezra sees within this miracle at Mara a lesson that health can sometimes be counterintuitive, and that things that you think are going to be bitter, are going to be mar, can in fact be the basis for a transformation, going from this to something different. And in this regard, it's important to also consider the Jewish people's own experience as slaves who have broken out of their slavery. And it's not just true for the channel theory as it relates to bodies, but it's also the channel theory as it relates to the proper orientation and organization of a person within a society. And that within this transformation of the bitter waters into sweet waters, there's also the possibility of the transformation of a person from being low to being high, from being a slave to somehow being something different. And this too is something which is baked deeply into Egyptian society, which was a predilection about the fixed place of every person within their society, and that there was not that ability to move from being a slave to being free. That was not part of how Egypt worked. And here within this symbol, this change, this complexity, this idea that that which is bitter can become sweet is also a parallel to the experience of the Jewish people themselves as people. Now, in this regard, I think it's worthwhile for us to think about the, the message of Mara and this possibility of transformation, of change in every generation, in every time. That when we go into our Seders, we're meant to not just believe that this was something that happened for our ancestors, but it's b'chol dor vador, in every generation, HaKadosh Baruch Hu matzilenu mi'adam, that God saves us from the hands of those who would come up against us. And that message of ongoing redemption, I think is something also worthwhile for us to consider when it comes to the practices within our lives that enslave us and the types of thinking which can also cause us to have problems. Now, we are in the midst of a terrible pandemic, and this is something which we should certainly make use of the best medical advice that we can, something that I mentioned in the very first part of the shiur, which is that everyone who has access to the vaccine should use it. And this is something for us to cherish and appreciate, this rapo yirape, this ability to seek out new information and understand new things. But at the same time, as you go through this pandemic, there's also a need for a certain extra humility that we as human beings should take to heart. That all the confidence that we might have had 2 years ago, 3 years ago, about the power of man to control our environment, to be master over our world, that's changed us a little bit. And even as we are rightfully so proud of human ingenuity when it comes to be able to develop a vaccine within a year of a disease of this degree, of a pandemic of this power, at the same time also the pandemic has taken a lot of lives. And when thinking about what it means to be a human being, we need to think about that just a little bit differently after this past year. And in that regard, I want to share with you a book that was actually shared with me by a doctor who works on medical modeling. And it's a book which talks about the limits of modeling. And it's in this quote, which I have for you, he speaks specifically about medicine, but it's true about all aspects of life, where we need to often ask ourselves the question, what are the numbers causing us to not pay attention to? What is it that we're not thinking about because we become so locked into our models that we've lost sight of what is really going on? So let's look at source number 15. The role of the practical economist, like that of the firefighter, the doctor, the dentist, and engineer, is to be a problem solver. So here he's speaking about, as opposed to the theoretical economist, he's talking about the practical economist. These other competent professionals, foxes, not hedgehogs. This is a reference to an idea from Isaiah Berlin about different ways that people think. Some people think very much just about one thing, and they're not thinking about the bigger picture. Those are hedgehogs. He's looking for foxes, people who think about many things, and they're always looking beyond their field of expertise to be finding and thinking about new things. These professionals, who are foxes and not hedgehogs, do not begin from a set of axioms or of an overarching theory. The major reason that medicine was of little practical use before the 20th century is that its practitioners did begin from theories which dominated medical thinking, but contributed little to real understanding. Most notoriously, the Greek physician Galeon's notion that from the second century AD, that illness was caused by imbalances between the humors. So this isn't a channel theory. This is a different theory. This is about the humors. Modern scientific medicine has been built through the piecemeal accretion of knowledge about details, making full use of inductive, deductive, and abductive reasoning, a process that is still contributing to an understanding of human anatomy and physiology. So here, the authors of this book that was written, I think just 2 years ago, make the point that it's critical for us to not fall into the trap of ideology when approaching economics. We should not be looking for a single theory of firefighting or dentistry. There's no grand theory of dentistry. It's really just all about looking for a problem and solving that problem. And likewise, that's true for medicine as well. And so when we read a pasuk of Ani Hashem Rofecha, this is to substitute for other ideas of refuah, other ideas of medicine that are coming out from within Egypt. And looking at source 16, we see a little bit about the spiritual side of the Egyptian practice of medicine. The ancient Egyptians thought that gods, demons, and spirits played a key role in causing diseases. Doctors believed that spirits blocked channels in the body and that this affected the way the body worked. They looked for ways to unblock these channels. They used a combination of prayer and natural or non-spiritual remedies. Most healers were also priests. The fact that ancient Egyptians had systems of letters and numbers meant they were able to record and develop ideas and make calculations. Documented ancient Egyptian medical literature is among the oldest in existence today. The ancient Egyptians had an organized economy and system of government, a settled population, social conventions, and properly enforced laws. Before this, the local people mainly lived a nomadic life. This stability allowed medical research to develop. Now, when the Jewish people leave Egypt, they leave that stability. They become once more nomadic. And within that new nomadic life, they can no longer turn back to this Egyptian wisdom to be their refuah. And in place of that, God says that I am going to be your rofeh, not to mean that you are not to get other doctors. That's not the appropriate conclusion of those psukim. But it certainly is appropriate to recognize that Hashem is replacing this theology around medicine that existed within Egypt. Whereas the Egyptians had understood everything about this prayer and the natural remedies that they required these priests to be healed, God takes the place of those Egyptian healers and priests. And in place of them, God speaks about other forms of faith, other forms, not of medicine, but of faith. And that's where God comes in and does not simply say, don't worship other gods, but don't accept that theology anymore of that everything flows from through the channels, where if something is sweet on the way in, it's sweet on the way through and it's sweet on the way out. Says Mara, no, that God is able to turn and to change and to take things that appear one way and make them something else. Think broader than this theology, this medicine of Egypt, and understand that the world is bigger and more complex than you might have imagined from within the confines of that thought system. Now here I'd like to return us to the Malbim, which was the concluding source in the second part of this drasha. And here the Malbim draws out some specific medical lessons from within the story of Mara, within the story of Yetziat Mitzrayim, that are really worthwhile for us to think about when we try to put some flesh on the bones of this idea that God is our healer. What does that mean exactly? And so he starts off by saying that God is a healer as opposed to being a master. That when it comes to a master, if you don't follow the master's instructions, the master punishes you because you disobeyed the master. When it comes to a doctor, the doctor tells you, you need to eat this and not that. Well, if you don't listen to the doctor and you feel sick as a result, is that because the doctor's punishing you? Of course not. It's because the doctor knows something about the operations of your body, that your body itself does that to you if you don't do what you're supposed to do. And utilizing this metaphor, the Malbim says that this is true also for how God interacts with us when it comes to the mitzvot. That when we live our lives, that the Torah is a spiritual manual for how we are to live our lives well. And if we do not keep the mitzvot, if we sin, then the sin itself begets its own punishment, just like a person who ignores medical advice. So he says here, "V'hinei hodia lahem she'atorah mitzvah shetzivah Hashem l'nei Yisrael lo hayu atzura kederach ha'adon mitzavet avdo el avdo rak kederach harofeh mitzavet hacholeh ritzoni she'adon hamitzavet el avdo ba'u hatzivuyim l'tzorech ha'adon hamitzavet she'yavod avodato." That when it comes to the master, he's giving the commands because that's what he wants for himself. That when the slave defies the master punishes him, the punishment has nothing to do with the actual crime. It has to do with the fact that the slave disobeyed the master. When a doctor commands a patient to do something, that command is not the command of a master. Rather, this is for the good of the patient. If a person does not listen to the doctor, it's not the doctor's fault. It's not because the doctor's punishing the patient. It's a result of simply not following the instructions and the natural course of events happening in this way. If we defy God, then the punishment comes as a result of the sin itself. So here we have one example of this ideology that in which it's not simply that God is replacing the rofeh, but that God is taking a certain understanding of refu'ah and transposing it onto the life of mitzvot. That Mara is a lesson. It is almost like a class in living our lives as we should, where according to the Malbim, God is borrowing from the framework of medicine as it existed in Egypt and using that as a tool to teach something to the Jewish people about how they are to relate to life beyond medicine. as far as all these spiritual things in life that are meant to be led a certain way. But it's not just this lesson, this metaphor. Also, when a doctor performs a procedure, the doctor does not just, start doing an incision on the patient and then say, okay, what do I do now? Rather, the doctor is prepared with all the stuff the doctor is going to need to conduct the surgery, then also to sew up afterwards so the patient's able to heal. And the Malbim says that something is similar also in terms of how God relates to us. That when God brings us an incision, when things that we experience are hard or difficult, guys, makdim tamid refu'ah lemakah. God always brings the cure before the disease. Now, it's interesting to look at the ups and downs of Jewish history and to see just how true that was, or places where we wish it was a little bit less true in terms of the makot that we experienced as a people. And I'd say that this too is of a piece of the pasuk that we often don't pay attention to, which is that this promise that God makes that any of the makot that God brought upon Egypt, God will not bring upon us, is specifically a contingent promise upon our observing the mitzvot. That it's very much like that rofeh, that we only are assured of not having these diseases if we listen to our doctors, that we have to listen to the instructions that we receive. It's with this idea that I want to just share an idea from Rabbeinu Nisim Gaon, and with this we'll move towards the close of the shiur. I began the first shiur, one of the early sources in the first part of this drasha, quoting an amazing source from the Ran. And the Ran was Rabbi Nisim Gaon, Rabbi Nisim ben Reuven of Gerona, living in Spain in the 14th century. And this was during a period of the Black Death, or the Black Plague. And he would give, in addition to writing one of the most famous commentaries on the Rif, on the Talmud, he also gave a series of drashot, of sermons that he gave, which were musar typically. These are perhaps one of the most classic texts of moral instruction. And he reflects upon his own day within this quote you can see in source number 3. He says, Vani Omer, ki inyanenu hayom karov inyan zeh, that our experience in our day is very close to this thing. Now, when he's referring to this thing, he means the experience of the Jewish people in the desert, the degree of hashgacha, of divine oversight over the lives of our ancestors at that time. And he says that what we're going through now is like that. And therefore I began from this section in order to reach this parallel, or this argument. And it is, Sha'avotenu lo ra'u et musar Hashem Elokeinu k'mo shera'inu anachnu, that our immediate ancestors, our parents and grandparents, they did not necessarily see the instruction of God the way that we see it ourselves. Aval bizmanam hayta ha'aretz yoshevet b'shalva olam kiminhago noheg. In their times, the world was basically a regular, normal existence. Everything working kiminhago, according to its natural, logical course. This is a quote from Tanakh, talk about prosperity, times of good times. And nevertheless, the Ran absorbs here a traditional Jewish approach, which is always to look to the past and to say that our ancestors were greater than we. We're often referred to as niskatznu hadorot, that we are below those who came before us. And here he says there that their pinkies were bigger than our thighs. And if there were some people in their time who would just go after the regular workings, the natural operations of the world, it would have been so surprising because they weren't witnessing miracles. They weren't seeing a world in which nature, as it were, seems to be broken somehow, that things are wrong. However, we're speaking now in the year 1348, have seen this musar, this instruction of God, for 13 years. 13 years they'd experienced this plague, this Black Death, the bubonic plague, until nishtanu sidrei bereshit. The world has changed. Ki yarad ra b'shana hahi larov yoshvei ha'olam. Because in that year, there was a terrible evil which fell upon the world, a pandemic. V'chalu bahem chalaim mishunim. Yevshar shnishluchu minhago shel olam. That there fell upon this world all sorts of sicknesses that were strange, that you cannot simply draw them out by the normal operations of the world. Aval kol maskil tzarich lahodot v'lamar etzba Elokim he. Every person must say and acknowledge that this is the finger of God. And this is a loaded word for us around Pesach, because of course, what is Rabbi Yossi HaGlili's drasha all about? It's about the use of this term by the Chartumei Mitzrayim, by the Egyptian magicians, who said about the kinim that this was the etzba Elokim, this was the finger of God, from which Rabbi Yossi HaGlili derives that if the etzba was 10 makot, then the yad of God, the hand of God that was revealed at Yam Suf must have been 50 makot. And it's that very same pasuk that the Ran is reading in his own time, to be able to say that there is a lesson here that we must take, and that is that we cannot just be seduced by that which appears to be the natural order of things. Now, as I say this, obviously, nature still continues around us, that we live within a natural world in which pandemics do happen, that any historian of medicine will tell you that pandemics are part of the natural world. But what I think is significant about what the Ran is saying is the degree to which we believe that we've conquered nature. That not just that nature is something that exists and has its natural processes, but it's the degree to which human beings can master those processes and thereby somehow become all powerful and not need God, and thereby be led astray by them. And this is something which remains eternally relevant, not just during the Black Plague, but also now as well. And that is to say that the world is bigger than us, that God is bigger than us. And it's critical for us to go through an experience like this one with the same approach that the Ran does, and to be able to say, Etzba Elokim He. Not that we can necessarily understand why. It's not like it was in Mitzrayim that we can say that this is God showing the Mitzrayim that I am Hashem, your God, or I am Hashem, the God who saves the Jewish people. But we can certainly appreciate that our understandings of an olam kiminhago noheg, that approach doesn't work the way that we might have believed it worked 16 months ago. That now we need to utilize a different frame under which to understand this. And I think it's also something for us to think about when it comes to other parts of our life as well. That in accepting that Hashem is our ultimate rofei, that God is our ultimate physician. This does not mean, again, I'm going to say this over and over again, this does not mean that a Jew does not get vaccines. Chas v'shalom, We make use of the best refu'ot that are possible, but we don't accept a scientism that says that the science is everything, that man is all powerful. That we reject. We reject the Rofim of Egypt, who believed that they had the spells, that they had the channel theory of life that could answer all our problems. We don't accept the Greeks and their ideas of humors. And whatever idea becomes an overarching ideology that comes and replaces God and says, this is the Olam, this is the Minhag, this is how it works. We say to that, Hashem's Arofeh. I'm sorry, we don't go with that. And this is I think it's an idea for us to think about as we read through the Haggadah as a whole, as we read about Rabbi Yossi Aglili, we read about Rabbi Eliezer, as we read about Rabbi Akiva. And as we hear them do their counting, and we appreciate the idea of the Vilna Gaon, I would argue that the Vilna Gaon, Rabbi Yossi Aglili, Rabbi Eliezer, and Rabbi Akiva are not just playing games with us when they say that there were 50, 200, and 250, and therefore we're not going to get those plagues because we were able to count them on our fingers. That's ridiculous. That makes no sense. But rather, the point here is that if we go through our lives looking and understanding that the world is bigger than our understanding, that there is something beyond our counting, that our counting is never sufficient to be able to fully encompass, that we always need to learn more, and that we can never somehow assume that we've got it figured out, that we know the Olam, we know it's Minhag, and this is the end of the story. There's no end to history. There's no end to the counting of God's involvement in this world. And I would argue that Rabbi Yossi Aglili, Rabbi Eliezer, and Rabbi Akiva are about a trajectory. There's not just to say that it was 200 and that's it, or it was 250 and that's it, but rather to say, we counted this much, you keep counting. You look at history. You see Hashem's involvement. You see B'chol Dor Vador, Omdim Aleinu L'Chaluseinu, and you keep counting. Because that's how we approach Yitzias Mitzrayim, and that's how we approach Jewish history, and that's how we approach Jewish destiny. To be able to never say we've got this world kimin hago, that we are always looking and seeking out the Hashem who is the Rofei, Hashem who turns things from marut, from bitterness, and turns them around to make them sweet. And as we at our seders make use of a matzah whose symbolic nature changes from being a symbol of avdut to being a symbol of cherut, we also eat mar, which is bitter, at our seder too. And we bring that into our celebration, even as we recall the tears, recall the bitterness. We understand that also it too might be made sweet, as the Kadosh Baruch Hu took the waters of Egypt and took the waters of Marah and transformed them from one direction and into the other. Okay, so I'm going to pause here. Any questions before we close?
I'll just ask a question.
Thank you, Bergman.
I got you. I guess I'm trying to understand what exactly the Egyptians did wrong. Is it because they think they understood everything, and is that the point, and we don't understand anything? It seems that they were also very religious, and they also relied on the gods that they had in their medicinal practices to help them. Whether the humor's theory is wrong or the Trier channel is wrong, that's a medicine mistake, right? Like, so we have better theories of treating people. So is the argument that they weren't humble enough in terms of their understanding of the world? Like, what exactly is the hashkafic change that you're alluding to? That is the point that anything bitter can become sweet. so you shouldn't necessarily think that your science is the be all and end all? Is that, I'm just trying to exactly figure out the change that we should be focusing on.
So, Brian, it's a great question that you're asking, and it comes from a certain rachmanus on the Egyptians, and I'm not going to criticize that. In that the Egyptians could only have the philosophies of their priests and of their kings, and that was the frame from which they were thinking. But we reject their gods, and part of Yetzias Mitzrayim is to say that their gods were not just wrong, but in some respects are evil, and that their gods justified this form of slavery and injustice that Egypt embodied. That in that huge culture, in this stratified culture, there was an understanding that you could enslave people unjustly, and that that problem was something that the priests participated in. And my argument is also, it wasn't just the priests, it was also the doctors. And the doctors also bought into that philosophy of which this this idea of the you might say the straight of what comes in and comes out, you are what you eat sort of philosophy is the indicative of a stratification of society of that of which HaKadosh Baruch Hu comes and replaces with other ideas of tzedek and mishpat and other values that are meant to challenge those. So on an Egyptian by Egyptian basis, you might be right that any given Egyptian, how can you expect them to somehow come to HaKadosh Baruch Hu? But as a whole, as a totality, the Egyptian philosophy is what is at debate here. This is one of the elements of Yetzias Mitzrayim is that Hashem is trying to bring judgments against the gods themselves, and part of those gods is this medical theory and theology.
Okay, thank you very much.
Great question. Thank you for that question, Rabbi Bergman.
The question, Rabbi.
Yes, David.
So the science of medicine at the time of that Shaila after the Black Plague obviously wasn't where it is today, but obviously it was already well advanced since the time of the Gemara. And with Mechila from all of the illustrious doctors on the call, is there a chance that we would say that when the Gemara said once upon a time, Tov shebarofim legehinnom, that's not true anymore? And if it is true, how could it be true given the tremendous value of refuah?
So this is a classic Gemara. I was asked about this Gemara when I applied for Yeshiva University. At that time, I was planning to be pre-med, and the interviewer asked me, how could I want to become a doctor when Tov shebarofim legehinnom? Now, just to translate that means the best doctors go to hell, which is not a nice thing to say. There are all sorts of drashot around that phrase. And I was thinking about including it in this shiur too. Honestly, David, I think you're right to bring it up within this context. And I think that there's an element of hubris which is part of the abilities and powers of healing, and that there certainly is a great temptation within it. But within our tradition, we say Rapo Yirapeh. That's the source that I did bring down, and the power which comes from refuah was obviously utilized by the Egyptian society towards theological and political ends that I was criticizing within this shiur. Now, can those ends or can those powers be abused today or in any generation? Yes, for sure they can be. That there certainly is that risk, and that's why every doctor should keep that Gemara in mind and try to avoid some of those temptations. But we as a people have always made use of the best medical advice that was available to us, and we have never discouraged our children from going off and becoming doctors. That Gemara is as a corrective. It's not meant to be an impediment that would stop medicine from being practiced and being appreciated within Jewish culture. Hope that's sufficient, but I think you create a sheer honest
Thank you.
just in that one Gemara. But thank you for bringing it up, David. Yeshar Koach. Okay, wonderful. Other questions or comments?
So, Rabbi, I just wanted to thank you. It's an honor, and it's our honor to be able, in my mother's memory, to be able to sponsor this. Your wise and timely drasha. It always is interesting to me how you can balance where God plays a role, where man plays a role. Like here, you have a vaccine that man has developed to offset this plague. And in other generations, we wouldn't have had the opportunity to develop these kinds of vaccines. Nobody knew about mRNA. Nobody knew about all kinds of viral vectors. And it seems like the process of history is very complicated as to the balance between God's role and man's role. Just wonder how you see that.
So I think Larry's absolutely right to have great appreciation for science, and that it really is something tremendous that we were able to, as human beings, able to develop a vaccine this quickly, to be able to not yet cure, but we're moving in that direction. And I think that there's a lot I would hope not worshipful towards the human endeavor in this, but certainly to be appreciative of what it is that we're able to do with this. I quoted in the first part of the shiur, the NIH director last week said that in many respects the vaccine was an answer to prayer, in which he saw it not just as a human accomplishment, but also in some respects as a divine partnership within it, which I think also touches a little bit on the balance that Larry is speaking about. But I tried to emphasize in this drasha a slightly different musar, not to say that man should not seek out medicine and seek out science, but that the world is bigger than us and puts forward challenges that are always pushing us to re-examine who we are and what we are. That we are not able to say that the world's just going kimin hagom, that everything's going is quote normal. And it's that side of the human interpretation of events that I think is more difficult. And I think it's also something we have to recognize that come next Pesach, are we going to say, well, everything's back to normal now? Or are we going to have gone through this and after, as like the Ron said, say, you know what, we have to think a little bit differently about our lives because of what we've been through. And that's true on an individual level, but also true on a communal, on a public level. I would hope that there are elements of the Ron's message which are able to be integrated into our lives, God willing, even after this horrible plague is over. And that lesson that I'm trying to draw from this is that nature is bigger than man, and that God is bigger than man. And that's a difficult lesson in every generation to really integrate. And I think that the experiences of this past year might be something that can help us integrate that idea just a little bit better. But this is a moving target. It's not like a yes or no. We all can feel God's presence and feel that humility at different levels of our lives. And also that idea can take hold within a society and within a culture to different degrees at different times. And my prayer is that we don't waste this crisis, that we utilize it to God willing, be better people, be that much more conscious of the importance of relationships, how we treat one another, and just how we've missed one another this past year. but also that we come out of this with a recognition that we don't have all the answers, and that we always have to keep our eyes and ears open, and that we always have to also be listening to the ultimate Rofei, that we have to be listening to the Keni Hashem Rofecha. That's something for us to very much keep in mind. Okay, Shukach, everyone. Thank you so much for participating. Wish everyone a Chag Kasher v'Sameach, a wonderful Pesach, a
Rabbi.
Pesach of
Thank you.
refuah, of healing. And we all get to know that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is our Rofei. And again, I want to thank the Krauses for sponsoring this drasha, and looking forward to seeing everyone again sometime soon in health and happiness, whether it be over Zoom calls or God willing one day soon in person too. Chag Sameach, everyone.
Amen.
Sameach.
Sameach.
Thank you,
Thanks so much,
Rabbi.
everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.